Hello, I'm Peter Junho Sang, founder and CEO of Beyond Form, and welcome to the special series Build It, where I speak to founders and their clients as to how they're building fashion technologies. This series gives you a glimpse into topics such as personal struggles, technical challenges, working in fashion, and more. On today's episode, I'm back again with Beatrice Newman, our head of education at Beyond Form Education. And today's topic is about the idea of failing. Startups fail all the time, and that's no different within the fashion industry. But for some reason, it's very difficult for fashion to talk about failing. Beatrice and I talk about why this is and how we can potentially overcome this within fashion.
Talking about failure is that we're not talking about it enough, and to be able to help educate and not just educate but support those who are starting up business and allowing them something to learn from that's tangible. There are many case studies in fashion, but I don't think any that really highlight well enough what the particular failure was.
Let's get this conversation going with Beatrice on today's episode of Venturing into Fashion Tech. How are you today, Beatrice?
I'm doing well, Peter. How are you?
I'm very good, thank you. Welcome back to the show again. Today we're talking about failing. Last week we talked about pivoting, now it's about outright failing. So let me set the scene for our listeners. It's tough to talk about failing, especially on platforms like LinkedIn, where every other post seems to be like about a success of some sort, someone tooting their own horn. However, in the startup world, failing is a natural part of the ecosystem, not different for the fashion industry either. According to a startup study by Genome Project, up to 90% of startups fail, with 70% failing within the first 20 months. However, entrepreneurs who embrace failure and learn from it are more likely to succeed in subsequent ventures. It's literally learning from your failures in the past. When it comes to fashion entrepreneurs and emerging businesses, we can also assume that same number applies. This year, for example, saw customer favorites like Mara Hoffman, Lee, The Vampire's Wife, or ceasing operations. These little mushroom emerging brands have just stopped all of a sudden. And it's not just about the new brands either, but also the existing ones as well. For example, the household names like Matches Fashion, which launched in 1987, also went under this summer. And this quarter is seeing many others struggling too. So let's talk about failing then, Beatrice. Pivoting is about changing to go in the right direction, but sometimes that change doesn't work, actually. But what happens with failure? What does it mean to you, and how has life taught you how to fail?
So when I started my fashion business, Korlekie, just over 11 years ago now, um, I imagined, as I think you said in previous episodes, Peter, you go to fashion design school and you expect to be the next big thing, after you graduate on a catwalk, etc. And that obviously just didn't happen. I think for me, that's probably my first failure. But would we call that a failure from a business perspective? No, maybe not. Because that was just, I think, more of a goal that required a lot more work. And I think when we start to talk or think about it from a very design-centered perspective, and by design, I just mean like fashion design graduates who don't necessarily get to understand business, reaching that sort of pinnacle of fame and success without thinking about everything else that you need to be able to get it and stay in it. It's not really something on their mind. And so it can have a sort of really warped understanding of what success and failure is. And that's an area of work that I like to consult and work on with startup brands. So I feel like for me, if I was thinking about it from a very design-centered perspective, I'm not necessarily in the business mind, I failed a lot because I didn't have that recognition. But in actual fact, if I didn't pivot to business mind, we can see that actually I didn't fail as much as thought I had done, because in a way I was building. Maybe the failure started coming in about 5 or 6 years into the brand, where I realized that a lot of the money that I was putting in business wise wasn't necessarily generating much capital or cash flow back for me. And there was just a consistency of, churning out collections and clothes collections, the collection, expecting something to happen, but without any real sort of data or metric point, any real understanding of business one-on-one selling, and how you make sales and whole marketing thing. So I fell pretty flat on my face with that one because I just had no clue. I think the second failure came in was not understanding who I was as a brand. I knew what I wanted to do, but how that was being activated in the sort of social and wider marketing space wasn't implemented successfully. So I was going off the back of what stylists or how stylists would interpret my brand through stylist loans, magazine, editorial spreads, covers, you name it, putting that on sort of my website, on my social media, and not realizing that this had a detrimental effect to audiences who would view my work and realize or understand, was I a stylist? Was I a photographer? Was I just a creative? And none of them really coming back to the point of these are clothes that you can actually buy because they didn't see me as a designer. So that was, I think, my second failure. I think understanding what then failure was, because I think failure to a lot of people for some reason, and that you can tell me, Peter, like it feels so definitive, but it's never really the end. It's just a point that happened. Then it's like, okay, get up, dust yourself off, learn from what didn't work, and then how do we make it work for, next time around, right?
The notion of failing is so personal to each individual, and I think the word itself is very emotionally charged. And I think that's where a lot of people, myself included, struggle with the fact that, okay, does failing mean that I am a failure and therefore that's my identity as a failure? I don't know if you feel the same way.
I do feel the same way because it goes back to your sort of intro where you talk about seeing LinkedIn posts or any social media where you don't really get to experience failure, its magnitude, or in a sort of shared community environment, because everyone wants to put their best foot forward, right? Who wants to hear about failure, especially when you're going for a job interview? Everyone wants to know that you've done really well. And so I feel like those feelings of failure in the word in itself are not misguided, because I think we as a society, I don't think we celebrate failure and what it actually does mean for getting individuals to where they need to be, or for even individuals who are now big names in whatever industry you want to call it, and allow them to be very successful individuals.
I don't know about you, but when I was studying at a fashion school, I never had once a talk or a class about what failing means and how to handle that, especially in an industry like fashion where it is very high.
Yeah, and I think this is maybe one of the sort of qualms I have with creative education, because it's set up in a sort of metric form or setting that again doesn't pioneer or support failure, because you've got grades. And majority of the time, even though I tell my students, I think it's really important to fail fast, fail quick, so that you can learn from it and redevelop. In that sense, well, sometimes it can be rewarded because you're being the analogy I give, when you go to a math exam, you're doing your GCSE or any test, the maths tutor would be like, even if you get the answer wrong, make sure you do your workings out on them in the margins and you'll get a mark for it. So I use that analogy for my students, but still in its whole entirety, or the sense when it comes to academia, is that it doesn't really allow students to feel safe enough to fail. They always want to get it right. And I think this is really bad for innovation as a whole. If we think about how far we've come as a society when it comes to invention, innovation, a lot of these inventions that you're seeing today went through more than one iteration and they failed. But because there's failures, they learned to create products that we now live by every single day.
I think that's so correct there, that that conversation just isn't being had. Going back to the subject of university, many of my university friends had the dream of making it in fashion, but unfortunately they didn't make it just because it is such a hard industry to keep going. And even when you're in it, it does take a lot of energy to stay in the industry. Why don't you think we talk more about it? in fashion then?
I think in some circles you'll be privileged enough for people to talk about it. Particularly when we go back to last episode when we were quoting the BLF article about professionals. I think you've reached a certain level, you don't care about what people think anymore because you're already there. So you can be like, oh, I failed and I did this. But I think when you're on the journey, you're a lot more careful with how you're scripting yourself and the stories you want people to know about yourself and the business and the things that you do. So I wouldn't say it's not necessarily prevalent in the space. It just depends on space or yeah, what space you are in, what industry maybe, because you don't necessarily hear a lot about failure in the fashion industry, or maybe you do, where you talk about, matches fashion and all of that. But it took time for sort of big brands like Matches Fashion to get to where it was now. So it's still in that case, it's all like smoke and mirrors, isn't it? You look at a brand online, you see it has so many different followers, and they look like they're doing great, but really when you dig a bit more deeper, maybe cash flow or something else in the business is not going as well. And I think in general, it's just a taboo. I do think there are ways in which we can facilitate healthier conversations when it comes to talking about failure. And when we ask ourselves what that looks like, perhaps this is where education comes in that can really support that facilitation. But you're still, I think, again, it's maybe how you package it. So it's not failure towards in a negative light, but failure towards what you're then wanting to do positively to, make those changes.
And we talked obviously that in the introduction about Matches Fashion, founded in 1987, is older than we are, Beatrice, just FYI, whoever's listening. So it is an institution, and obviously this year we also heard Farfetch being rescued by Coupang in Korea, for example. This quarter, LVMH, Kering Groups have recorded a dip in sales as well, and it's just seen as such a bad thing for the industry. But I also think that sometimes it is needed to reset some elements within the industry itself. I mentioned as well the emerging designers, like the Vampire's Wife, for example, going under, which is such a cult hit when it comes to emerging brands. So why do you think a lot of emerging brands are failing? What are the common reasons for failure of a fashion startup specifically?
Well, I think if we're really going to hit the nail on the head, and it's going back to the whole point of this conversation when we're talking about failure, is that we're not talking about it enough, and to be able to help educate and not just educate but support those who are starting up business and allowing them something to learn from that's tangible. There are many case studies in fashion, but I don't think any that really highlight well enough what the particular failure was, or I feel like it just kind of brushes the surface. And so if you are developing a fashion brand, if we're just being very specific, it can be a very long, hard road towards sort of making mini failures and being very conscious of the decisions that you're making. And this really goes back to the conversation we had earlier on when we're talking about pivoting, right? Because the whole point of pivoting is you're about to fail, or you sense that what your path was is not maybe the right path anymore. So you're making those pivots based on the metrics to ensure that you are able to survive. But not a lot of designers are able to pivot because, again, as I mentioned in the last episode, they're very stuck in their ways and how they expect things to go. And just because you're designing clothes doesn't mean you don't change or you can't consider what is, let's say, in the zeitgeist, what people like, what they don't like, and how that can really inform the direction of your business to ensure its longevity.
Thing is about as well finding a really good business partner. Most of the time, a lot of startups fail because of funding, because of many reasons. As we all know, fashion is extremely expensive to get going when it comes to a fashion brand. For example, household names like Alexander McQueen, John Galliano went bankrupt at some point in their early careers as well, and they had to be a rescue. In Galliano's case, more than one. So it's not necessarily something new. I think it's maybe okay when you go to start your own fashion brand, aside from, of course, doing beautiful designs, making beautiful products, you need to think about who's going to be able to plug in those gaps within your business as well. Another element is that go-to-market strategy, and we've talked about this previously on the podcast show. If you have amazing, beautiful products, but nobody knows how to purchase it or even sees you or getting eyeballs about what you're doing, of course you're not going to succeed as well. So those are some of the sorts of things that I always see when coming across fashion startups. You talked a little bit there about, at the start, your personal journey and specifically with your fashion brand, Korlekie. If you could go backwards, and obviously you talked there what you classed as failures, what would you have done differently to avoid what you deemed as failing?
I think the whole brand awareness thing stuck out like a sore thumb only when I had taken a back seat, I think a hiatus of a year or 2 years, and really began to understand the business of fashion away from just creating. And I realized then I just wasn't telling a story, or no one really understood what Korlekie was all about. So if I was to go back, I think it would just be being unapologetically me, because a lot of what I'm doing now, I feel like just maybe trying to be like everybody else, because I felt like being myself or offering what I could offer wasn't going to sell. Really, the whole the growth of Korlekie potentially missed quite a lot of opportunities because the market's just come incredibly saturated since then. But in any case, things happen for the reason that they happen, and Korlekie is doing really well now from those learned experiences. But that would certainly be one of the ones that I would want to redo again if I had the opportunity. And it's really defining and understanding the narrative of my story and the product offering that I have to give to my customer. We talk a lot about fashion design, not necessarily having a lot of business acumen embedded into curriculum. Although I do think that's changing now. I mean, I've been in academia, particularly at University of East London, for just 5 years, and it is something that is changing. But still, in our time, Peter, you can remember there was the business embedment apart from, I guess, costing out your garments, and that was that, right? So I feel like with bettering or more increased knowledge in what it means to run a successful business would have been a lot more beneficial to me rather than expecting it to be in Selfridges or Harrods and making big bucks, because that's just not how it works anyway.
I had one module in business, and I can remember this so vividly because I was so bad. It was a team project, and we had to come up with a business idea for the fashion industry. It was a module that brought together not just the design practice, but also the management students as well. As you can imagine, the design students had zero clue of what was happening. And I don't feel we were actually taught very much in that module. Like, yes, we can come up with an idea, but if we don't understand the principles of business, then the idea is just going to be like a very top line idea. I think for creators, I'm going back to Korlekie. What I saw, and you and I have spoken about this previously, and you mentioned that they're of fame. Quite often, we're taught as fledgling fashion designers and fashion brands is to go and get as much press as possible. Get your pieces on a celebrity, get your pieces in this magazine. But as you and I have found out, that isn't necessarily going to be a sure win for you. Your stuff has been featured on celebrities. Paloma Faith, Rita Ora, for example. When I was doing my fashion brand, I was featured on several athletes and on a couple of TV actors as well. But that doesn't mean anything. Let's face it, it didn't mean that it didn't, and it doesn't mean that our brands rocketed into the stratosphere. And I think it's very important to understand what you learn in fashion school or what the notion of doing a fashion brand is very different to what it is in reality. And what I've seen you do very well successfully is okay, let's just change the approach. Apply more of a tech or a more startup-y methodology to building the brand. For example, you've been continuously gaining customer feedback via social media, favorite colors, favorite silhouettes, and so forth. which I think has worked for you tremendously. Can you tell us a bit about that learnings? Actually, okay, switching the approach.
In design school, you're taught to create X amount of flows for a collection, but in reality, that's really just not sustainable, particularly if you don't have access to good startup funds and sort of money aside. You don't really have customers yet, really. I mean, you might have a few friends or family or someone somewhere said they were going to buy it, but that's just a couple of customers. You need more than that to sustain your business throughout the year. So the approach I took was to sort of look at my catalog of sort of design, sort of building up that archetype that would really express Korlekie, and deciding to just focus on that one product, something that people could relate to and really be able to define the brand on, because that's also part of my storytelling, right? And then instead of creating a collection for so many different things, I started to take into consideration, this is where we talk about the double diamond and the theory, right? Well, what is the problem? So I started to look at, well, if a customer was going to buy my stuff, what would be some of the key problems that they might be facing? And what have I seen by competitors in the market that are not really being done well enough and customers complaining about? And a lot of that came down to sizing and structure, particularly when it comes to crochet knitwear, which is part of what I do as a brand, a strong part that I do and that I have really started on and have sort of really professionalized my approach on. So I decided to build 3 tops that I felt like answered the need of very different body shapes and sizes. So you had the bustier, which would work really well for sort of larger bust clientele, curvaceous. Had the tank top, which worked for more athletic figures and for women who wanted more sort of strap support, but still something quite beautiful and covered. And then you had the bralette, which worked very well on more petite figures and interestingly enough, related more culturally with Asian customers. Something to be looked into that, but I found that really fascinating. And then when I launched with those tops, you could immediately automatically see who my customer was because of the people that were ordering, the feedback that I was getting, and what was becoming would essentially become my hero products, such as the tank top. And then, as you mentioned, Peter, listening to this feedback, not really pivoting until actually my customers would come back and say they would want a custom. So maybe the tank top, turn it into a dress. What would that look like? Made it, put it out there in picture form. Someone else said they loved it, and you start to offer it, and then you might offer it in a different colorway or something like that. So a lot of my pivoting has happened very, very fast, but I can be so sure of my pivots because I know my customer wants it, and I know they want it because they paid for it first before I've actually done the service, as opposed to doing the service first and then waiting to see if people would buy into it.
So we've talked a lot about the individual and the individual emerging startup. So let's just zoom out a little bit. What do you think the fashion industry is failing at and why?
What I've alluded to is that it's just very, very saturated right now. It's actually not about the collection anymore. It's about the customer. It's about what I'm offering, how I offer it. Like, by the time they get to that place, money's already gone, they're already tired, and it's been detrimental to the space or area that they've worked in, because I think coming back from that and trying to survive that fall is a very difficult thing to do. I know, because I took a 2-year hiatus and was very lucky to be able to get back again the tactic that I took, and it's taken me some time to build, but thank God year on year it's now growing. But not everybody has that opportunity and chance, and it should really be happening from the get-go.
And you talking about that coming back into the game, I think part of failing is also character building as well. It's about building that resilience, it's about building tenacity and that ability to bounce back. Fashion requires that from you, especially when it's not going your way. Had John Galliano or McQueen given up when they went bankrupt, we wouldn't have these amazing design references now that are historically and culturally so important for us as an industry. What do you think about Shein's impending IPO then? Is that an industry win or an industry fail, do you think?
I think if you're asking me, as you are, I feel like it's an industry fail, because when you start to pick the ethics behind Shein, particularly on sustainability and what it means for the face of fashion moving forward, I just don't think it's setting a good president for the industry? I mean, what do you think?
What do I think? I think it's interesting to see how such a big company has been able to go this far built on super cheap clothing to IPO stage. That's like not nothing. And regardless if we think it's a win or a fail, the customer is buying. And I think we can't change the customer. So I think that's not necessarily a fashion fail. I think it's potentially a humanity fail if we go even bigger.
I guess you're right. It is humanity spell. I would maybe argue though whether we can teach the customer, because I think we can. If we think about how far fashion has come in industry and where we are at this stage that we are in, it's because fashion's really led the way. Corporations have led the way in feeding that appetite for the customer. In order for that appetite to be quenched, or at least for allowing the customer to make more informed choices in what they buy, it's education. Everything that we talk about is education. The lack of understanding of failure is education. So agree to disagree with you there.
Education and the fact that it's quite difficult for a lot of people economically at the moment. So I think that's feeding into it as well. So then thinking about, okay, we've talked about failing, and of course, nobody wants to fail at any given moment in time. So let's talk about mitigating that risk and how can we potentially avoid failure within the industry. So how can established brands and retailers work with new emerging talent to help them along?
I think that's a tough question. And it's one I've been asking myself in the next iteration of Korlekie as we try to scale and build. Because if we're being brutally honest, I'm on a made to order structure at the moment for those of you who might not know or might not be aware. And whilst that's been really great, if the business is supposed to wanting to grow exponentially into something a little bit more viable and sustainable, wholesale's king, right? A bigger chunk of money coming through. And if it's not wholesale, then collaborations. But you then have the sort of legal conversations as well that could just be, I think, complicated and difficult to navigate. And when I talk about legal, I'm talking about who owns the designs. Larger corporations are going to be open and honest about the fact that your designs, a particular design, or how to say, something that's inherent to you as a brand that's going to be kept within collaboration, or would that be taken out externally? So I think you've got those trouble areas to navigate. But aside from that, I would definitely say working or trying to build cross collaborations is definitely the way to go in building sustainability, particularly also in, I think, building brand awareness. And we've got some really great collaborations that have come through. There I mentioned H&M and the larger brands, the larger brand names, which when you talk about accessibility, Peter, that's exactly what they do.
I think it's well about looking beyond those one-off initiatives or collaborations, but really think about how can we build into the industry longevity, whether that's from a fashion council, larger fashion retailer, or even at the education system. You know, we talked about previously on the podcast show how we were able to get funding from our universities, for example. So it's like, how can we go beyond those very one-off activities and going further? But on that point, let's finish off this episode with a quick fire round of questions, Beatrice. The first answer that comes to your head. Are you ready?
Let's do it.
Fast fashion or slow fashion? Which do you believe is more prone to failure?
Oh, wow. I was about to, thought you were going to tell me which one would I prefer. Prone to failure. That's a difficult question because I would hope fast fashion is, but if we're being honest, I don't think it is. So I don't think I'm going to answer that question. I don't know.
Creative freedom or commercial sensibility?
Commercial sensibility.
Risk taking or caution? Which approach do you think is better for long term success in fashion?
Be caution, but side of risk taking. It's not either or.
Name a fashion brand that turned a failure into a success story.
I'm just going to go with the easy one that you mentioned. Alexander McQueen.
Number one mistake you see new designers making too often.
Launch with a 10-piece collection.
Yeah, I think we can't, hone that in enough. Don't go full on shebang, 50 looks. I think the keyword we're looking for is hero product. So on that point, thank you so much for your time, Beatrice.
Thank you, Peter.
Thanks for listening. Don't forget to click follow to keep up to date with the latest episodes. And if you like this episode, please give us a review. If you want us to feature a specific theme or guest, please give us a message at beyondform.io. I will see you very soon.